but 'tis the way of things. So we have been working on the psoas for the last 3 weeks or so. And this practice is really kind of the culmination and also integration of that work. And one of the things that I find interesting with yoga, and really all things, is that the order of operation matters. For example, if you put on your pants and then put on your shoes, everything's easy breezy. If you put on your shoes and then put on your pants, it's a mess. And similarly with the alignment principles and things in the body, sometimes if you try to do certain things too early, it's a mess. But if you kind of go in a certain order of operations, often things become easy breezy. For example, one of the common cues I use is to move from the sacrum, to treat the sacrum as the root and rudder of the spine. But that is very challenging to do if the psoas is tight and pulling on the lumbar or pulling on the femur bones. And the students that I see that are the most challenged by back bends, it's usually because there's a restriction in the hip flexors, there's a restriction in the psoas. So then the body's just not ready for some of these other alignment principles. So we've done 3 weeks of psoas releasing work. There's psoas releasing work in the beginning of this sequence. And now we're starting to step into this deeper relationship with the sacrum. And I'm going to show you a handful of slides that will help you visualize and relate to these principles more fully. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So for several weeks, we have been exploring the psoas. And the psoas attaches to all of the lumbar vertebra and also the top of the femur bone. When it is tight, it has a tendency sometimes to pull on the lower back. And this is when people feel like chronic, crunchy, scrunchy stuff in the lower back, especially at the top of the sacrum. But it can also do the opposite, where it pulls the femur bones forward and pulls the curve out of the lower back. So flattening the lower back, giving a perception of the buttocks being tucked under. When we get the psoas more open, released, and relaxed, then we actually have more access to the movements of the spine that are more intuitive and organic. And the spine has this vertebra disc kind of slinky structure. And then it hits fused bone at the sacrum. And the sacrum can really do two things. It can do nutation, which is this kind of nodding in that you see here. And that helps set off the curve in the lower back. The sacrum can also do what's called counter-nutation, which it nods out, right? It goes that way. And then it pulls the lower back into flexion, into a forward bend. And this dance between the sacrum and the lower back is called the sacro-lumbar rhythm. So it's meant to be a wave pattern. It's meant to have flow and fluidity. The challenging part is that the sacrum is a part of the spine, but it is also attached to the pelvis. So anytime we're talking about the sacrum, we also have to take into account the whole pelvis. And the sacrum attaches to the pelvis at what's called the sacroiliac joint. This is a joint designed for stability. When it becomes unstable, and it does for many, 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 many yogis, that's dysfunction. And the body tells us that there's dysfunction with the language of pain. And when this joint gets a little off, you have pain on kind of like the lower back on one side. You'll usually have a hard time bearing weight on that leg. It'll just feel like something's off, something's locked up, something's kind of pinchy, scrunchy, aggravated. And so we actually create stability for this joint by breathing fully and deeply, especially the elongated exhale where we whoosh the air out of the diaphragm and contract the upper abdominal fibers. So that forceful exhale that we've worked on many times helps stabilize and support the lower back and this joint in particular. Because of the relationship of the sacrum to the pelvis, we will always be talking about the pelvis when we're talking about the sacrum. So for example, we often talk about the hip points, which are these points here. The technical term is ASIS, anterior superior iliac spine. And we use the hip points to gauge where and how the pelvis is moving, because that helps us gauge where and how the sacrum is moving. Now, the other major bony landmark here are the sitting bones, the ischial tuberosities. We also use them to talk about where the pelvis is. The hamstrings attach here. And then I'm just going to point it out because everyone always asks, this is the tailbone. It's very small, you know, and kind of the very tip of the sacrum. So what we're going to be doing in class is moving the sacrum in order to steer the spine, in order to have more fluidity and grace in our back bending, which is full spinal extension, and forward bending, full spinal flexion. Now, what I find is when students steer from the sacrum, they're less likely to push into the lower back during the back bending, and also less likely to kind of like overly round, do kind of like the hunchback during the forward bending. Before we move on from the slides, any questions? Awesome. Onward and upward we go. We're going to start laying down. Once you're laying down, place your feet on the floor. Drop the inner edge of your knees together. Take a few moments to breathe. Feel the slope of your sacrum. Allow any tissue in the pelvis, lower back to release and relax. And then separate your knees hip distance apart, feet hip distance apart. Put the heel of your hand on your hip points, the ASIS. And then roll the pelvis forward so you have a little mouse house, a little bit of curve in your lower back. This is like cow. And then exhale, pull the pelvic floor up, low belly down, ribs in and down, and flatten your lower back to the floor. Again, inhale, roll the pelvis forward. This will create nutation, that nodding in of the sacrum, and the natural lumbar curve. Exhale, you flex. You tuck under a little bit with the sitting bones. The pelvis tilts backward, the sacrum nods out, and you flex the lower back. Again, inhale, roll the pelvis forward. This is an anterior tilt to the pelvis, nutation in the sacrum. Exhale, posterior tilt to the pelvis, counter-nutation in the sacrum. Keep going with your own breath. The good news is when you learn these alignment principles and the natural rhythms of the body, then it's like you can get in that current. And in the beginning, it's going to require some mental jump rope. but it's kind of like learning a musical instrument. When you learn the scales, then you can play, you can get creative, you can compose, and we're learning the structures of the body so that we move with more fluidity and grace.